put in requests and started to make stirrings about fees for services that THPOs or tribes might provide agencies. The way to start this is to stand up in the front so I can have my mug shot on this video. But the way to proceed on this is in, most of us know that in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act was enacted by Congress, and within a matter of a few years, most of the states had signed up and were off by the 1970, 71 in building their programs. As Samantha had brought up in some of her presentation, the 60s was a time for environmental awareness and renewal. The 70s were a matter of implementing some of that. In the 80s, federal government became recognizant of tribal sovereignty. The Indian Self-Determination Act passed early in the 80s, and it was in later 80s and into the early 90s that the Historic Preservation Act was revisited, particularly in 1992, with amendments that allowed tribes to now be equivalent to states in developing their Tribal Historic Preservation Office programs. You see, prior to that, states had jurisdiction through THPOs on tribal lands. So in 1992, the act was amended and allowed tribes to start to go into this process and become THPOs. Now, most of you might know there's something like 540 tribes in the country and counting, as there's a recognized, unrecognized process. And as we speak today, there's probably about 140 some tribes that have actually signed up to become THPOs. So, assuming that at least half, if not more, of tribes in the country will become THPOs in the years, there's a large process and a large amount of work to be done in getting the rest of the tribes signed up. If you look at those dates, states have had 30 years of headway in developing their programs, and tribes are now just starting to develop their programs. And I say all that as an introduction to the fact of funding. I think there's some salient statistics. You compare the largest tribe in the country, the Navajo Nation, and what their THPO budget is. Their acreage size is roughly comparative to, I think it was Rhode Island or Connecticut, but one of our smaller states in the United States. And if you just look at the funding disparity between Navajo Nation and some of those smaller THPOs in those smaller states, those smaller state THPOs are being provided twice as much funds as the Navajo Nation. Okay, and they've had 30 years to establish a program, where the Navajo Nation has only been doing it for several years. I was a THPO. I was one of the first through the Yurok tribe in Northern California, to become a THPO. There's a few others in the room that were very early on in that process. I think perhaps Natalie was one of the first there, and I know Kelly was really close, maybe in the first or second year, with Lac de Flambeau. First year? So, what we became painfully aware of as THPOs, and in trying to establish these programs and educating tribal membership and tribal leadership and agencies that were doing business and still used to doing business with a THPO and their programs and funding and at their levels that they could provide, was the funding was just woefully inadequate. And as it was not enough, it was in a not equivalent, not equitable to what states were getting. The other problem was, as every year more tribes signed up, the THPO funding pie got smaller and smaller because they didn't appropriate. Then every once in a while, an increase of appropriation would be put into the Historic Preservation Fund by an act of Congress, and it'd be a glut, and suddenly you'd get a spike in your budget for 1 year, but then the next year 10 more tribes would come in, and the next year another 15 would come in, and then another 10, without an increase in funding. So what this, where this puts tribes, THPO tribes, is that they have several decisions to make. Either they can work for free, or they can simply work less, work part-time, or they can increase their funding in other ways while they still continue to do the things to inform Congress that more money is needed for the Historic Preservation Fund, and particularly for the THPO line item of that fund. So those are the three options. Work for free, work less, or go get more money. So, and this is not a new problem. States, SHPOs in developing their programs also ran into similar hurdles during the 70s, and most of them stepped up to figure out ways of increasing their funding. One of the ways was to go get a state match, which is required under the Historic Preservation Fund program. Tribes are not required to match, so tribal government is not required to match National Park Service funds that come to the THPO programs. And so SHPOs have also done other things, like establish fees for services for some of the services they provide. And so what I think where we are right now in the THPO movement across the country is tribes are coming up with the same problems and coming up with some of the same solutions. And you're starting to see THPO tribes starting to ask and develop fee for services concepts, and to parlay those concepts with the agencies, with the consultants working for the agencies, to get them to understand that this work is important, it's precious, underfunded, and THPOs, in order to be responsive, need funding. There's a myth that said, that is assumed, that Park Service provides THPOs funds, that THPO has stepped up to implement those responsibilities, including response to Section 106 consultations, and so therefore, if a tribe has accepted that money, they should perform that responsibility. And the fact of the matter is, it just simply doesn't work that way. There's also a myth that under consultation, tribes have an obligation to protect their heritage, and that is unfathomable, unmitigable, and it's just an inherent thing about being a Native American individual or tribe or community, that you must protect your heritage. And so an agency that comes in with a consultation obligation and knocks on the door and says, tribe, tell me of your sites. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. Tell us if you have any cultural concerns. And that agency may expect that the tribe has to just step up. And if they cannot step up, that's because perhaps they're not paying attention to their heritage. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of projects across the country, I'm not just picking on transportation projects, are not necessarily the will of the tribe. It's not the tribe's prerogative to have a project here or a project there or this cell tower here. It simply comes at them. And so I think there's a bit of a false sense of what a tribe's obligations are. So at any rate, I think there is a couple programs. There's one THPO program out west who's actually gotten with this, has developed a website. If you want to consult with that THPO and that tribe, you go to their website, and you better have your credit card. And if they've got PayPal set up, and you swipe that card, and there's a fee just to enter your project into their website, and for them to go to their website on a daily basis and see what projects have come in. And based upon that initial interaction fee, that THPO will respond and will say, okay, for us to further engage in this, here are the types of services we can offer, and if you want to go further with this consultation, here's the types of services that you will pay for. And that's, my hat's off to that tribe for being innovative and embracing the electronic world. And that's one example that has just come online in the last couple years. And so, no doubt, you'll see other tribes, including those in Wisconsin, following suit. As a THPO in California, I did fee for services. I had a staff of 8 to fulfill all the obligations of my responsibilities through the Historic Preservation Act, and additional responsibilities that the tribe put on me, such as NAGPRA, ARPA, language, archives, elders committee, all of those other things. And the tribe provided some of my budget. But they provided about 40%, even though that was not required. But that was the prerogative of that tribe. However, I quickly understood in my program at UROC that the inventory is key. If you do not know where your resources are and do not have those readily available and at hand, you're going to be less responsive to both tribal and non-tribal agency requests. So I quickly put that together. And as I was doing that, I put that together in paper because at that time, GIS and databases were not as robust and as plentiful and as cheap as they are today. And obviously, about 4 or 5 years after getting that set up and implementing that inventory, along comes a need to electrify it. And of course, that costs money. Money which I was not getting anywhere. Yet, I was providing a service. People came to expect, agencies came to expect that we had this inventory and it would be there and we would disseminate that information as needed. But we couldn't sustain that. So we developed a fee for services around that. People thought that it was a bit exorbitant. We charged 120 bucks an hour. So when a agency put in a request and said, tell us what your cultural things are, we would charge, and normally we would take anywhere from a half an hour to 2 hours, 3 hours sometimes, depending on the scope and size and complexity of a project, to generate from our database, take into account the site records we had, take into account where survey polygons had been, take into account the value, the merits of that survey. Was it up to date? Was it up to current standards and methods? We did these types of analysis, and we also had a robust archive with elder interviews, some handwritten, some on video, which took our staff time to go back and look at that. And by the way, in our rush to document elders who were knowledge bearers who tend to be older, tend to be prone to health issues, and tend to pass away quicker than the general population in America, our efforts were to document that stuff. And so we were in a rush to document. Yet the transcription of a lot of those videos and tapes, cassette tapes back in the day, it takes a long time to actually transcribe that into text. And in our rush, we got a big glut of volume of information, but we did not transcribe it. We did not have the funds to do that. And so when an agency came in and we knew that elder so-and-so was from a certain area and spoke and knew about what was important in that area, and here came an agency with a project, our staff had to go into our archives and do that transcription because we didn't do it when we first collected it. That took time, that took money. And we passed those costs on to projects and on to agencies. There was resistance to that idea. People felt that that was exorbitant. Oh, by the way, when we released that information, we would often request agencies and consultants to sign confidentiality agreements. And part of that confidentiality agreement was we requested that they would submit their reports, their findings, their site records, if they did ethnography with tribal elders, to submit that back to our archives so we could enter that into our database. And so part of that cost, that 120 bucks, was not just for us to usher out a bunch of information, but assuming 6 months, a year, 2 years later, we were going to get something back that we're going to have to process. And so that's what that cost covered, was that end part of the process as well. After time, there was resistance to paying that cost. But after time, agencies came to love us. They came to know that we had information that oftentimes was better, more detailed than what could be found in state archives, what could be found in agencies' own archives, and it was of value. And they came to realize that we were professional in how we managed it, how we disseminated that information, and how we protected it. And in the end, we provided a good service. And we could have only provided that service if the fees were there to pay for my staff to take the time to do the work. There's other areas where fee for services can happen. Inventory is one place. And it's one place that SHPOs across the country have various fee for service schedules and collect those fees. You know, sometimes it's important to get people out into the field, site visits, project site visits. An elder may not have recollections of a place until they actually go there. And that takes staff time, not only just to go pick up that elder at the house, but usually when you go to pick up an elder at a house, you have to sit and visit with the family and explain what's going on with the project before that person will consent to doing something. And that all takes time. Once you have an elder in your car, you have an obligation or responsibility that is pretty high. And you have to get them there in comfort, you have to take care of their needs, you need to see what information they may be able to provide, document that information on site, and get them back to their homes, and there's usually aftermath. You have to, and then at that point, stay at that home and explain what has just happened, and that is all time and cost. So site visits, whether by just staff or with others, members of an Indian community, you know, that's a very valuable thing, and it's a service, and I think it should be covered in cost. And if the tribe wants to set up a schedule, a fee schedule for that type of service, and if that service is of benefit to an agency to help them understand the impacts of their project, my attitude, just my personal attitude, is so be it. You know, we all are involved in various economic transactions to make a better world, and I don't see why tribes can't do the same. I'd say, in closing, a couple areas of advice. On the one hand, if tribes are to get into the fee-for-services business, particularly in cultural resources, I would, one, recommend that they do establish their services and fees in a deliberate manner, in a schedule, established perhaps by an authority, if not the THPO themselves, by perhaps the THPO's Historical Resources Commission, or perhaps by a tribal council that has authority to establish these types of costs and schedules. That would show to agencies that tribes are deliberate, are measured in what they are putting out onto the rest of the agencies in the world, and that that schedule is something that's sanctioned by a governing body and cannot be changed willy-nilly based upon whether I like or dislike someone that comes in the door. That would be one thing on the side of tribes, is to do that in a very professional and deliberate manner with proper authorities. On the other hand, I would suggest that to those agencies that see this coming and can accept this as a normal procedure, as it's happened in other governmental bodies like SHPOs, that if there's a fear to that, I would suggest rather than fighting that, get to the table. Negotiate something. Perhaps there's a way to streamline a process, define what exactly the services would be needed and which services would not be needed. And if you're fearful that there might be price gouging or something of this sort, sit down and negotiate that sooner than later. I'm not sure if that's a wise thing to do in a programmatic agreement approach. It could be attempted, but programmatic agreements often take a long time to negotiate. And it might be something that can be negotiated ahead. And if then a programmatic agreement is later ensues, that could be then attached as an appendix or something if fees for services is part of a programmatic agreement approach to conducting Section 106. So that would be another sort of area of advice you might want to consider. I think two closing remarks. Tribes also understand that contracting is a place to go, not only for gaining money or to cover their costs of their programs, but contracting cultural resources. Also, tribes quickly learn that those who control the reports and the authoring of those reports oftentimes have a huge say in what those reports come out looking like, even though agencies have review prerogatives over their consultants. So, tribes, seeing this, that this is how the game is played for their heritage, say, well, for financial reasons and for control of documents and recommendations that documents provide, that they want to get into that business of cultural resources management, particularly cultural resources surveys and ethnographic reports and so on and so forth. I would suggest that those types of activities, I'm not quite sure of Wisconsin law and whether that's authorized or not. I know it is in California with California Department of Transportation, but I would suggest, because those costs are more complex, those projects, doing those types of things are more complex, that perhaps those are negotiated as contracts rather than straight up fees for services. But that's just advice. The last thing I would advise is tribes should never put themselves in the position of suggesting that for a cost they will provide a signature as a THPO concurrence on a Section 106 process. I don't think that that would be terribly legal. So the fees for services are the services to reach a place where a THPO might sign or I should say concur or not concur with a Section 106 undertaking. But you cannot, I don't believe, legally ask for money for a signature. I don't think that that would go up to court. I think there was one last point. It's evading me at the moment. But I guess in closing, I would recommend that groups embrace this sort of progression that THPOs are bringing to the table. I don't see it stopping, and it's the same process that SHPOs implemented decades ago. Thank you.